Hi everyone and welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about SDDC Manager and we're going to walk over some of the GUI features, going to look at some of the menus, what it looks like when you log in, etc. We're also going to go over where it fits in VCF with regards to the structure and the architecture, and we're going to talk then as well about things that you should change in SDDC Manager and actions you should perform there, and some of the actions that you can perform in, say, the vCenter or the NSX Manager. We'll also talk about the impact of performing things outside of SDDC Manager that you should perform inside of it, and how that can affect things like lifecycle and operations of VCF. So before we go into it, if you could hit subscribe and like on the video on the options below, that'd be really appreciative. And then we're going to jump into the SDDC Manager. Thanks very much. So I wanted to cover first of all some of the architectural elements around VCF, just to explain where SDDC Manager fits into it. So if we look at a high level overview and we focus on the SDDC Manager, this helps us understand also where and how we should make change in the environment for certain elements. So the SDDC Manager, if we draw it at the top here, is basically responsible for managing the infrastructure components of VCF. Is an easy way to think of it. It does manage some configuration elements, but a lot of the granular configuration for each of the products is actually conducted on them themselves. So for this example here, we say infra management. What this covers is something like provisioning new hardware. So provisioning new hosts into the environment. We would build workload domains. We would also delete workload domains at this level. And this would delete, when we do this task, this creates a vCenter. So a vCenter is created when we create, and a vCenter is deleted when we delete, for a workload domain that is. At the cluster level, if we were to create clusters, which we also do at the SDDC Manager level, this is done inside a vCenter. So it will use one of the existing vCenters that is built when the environment is provisioned. So taking that into consideration, the next layer down from SDDC Manager is the actual vCenter itself. So if we go down and now draw our vCenters, our vCenters are provisioned based on the workload domains we provisioned. So each workload domain is a vCenter. Okay, we can provision a maximum of 14 workload domains plus the management one, so 15 in total, but you can provision 14 on top. This is due to the limitations in link clone, because all of these virtual centers that are provisioned as part of the same SDDC Manager would all be linked in a link clone configuration. So what do we do in this vCenter here? So this vCenter is where we would perform activities such as HA. We'd do DRS if we were configuring things like DRS groups as an example. We would configure that here. If we had to configure something on a virtual machine, so as an example, if we were doing like CPU memory, right sizing sort of thing, we would do all of that in the vCenter at the VM type level. If we were doing something like resource pool management as well, we would do that in the vCenter. So we would do resource management. This could be shares, either pools or on the VM. And we would conduct all of that type of configuration inside the vCenter. So although the SDDC Manager, like I said, is managing the infrastructure, the configuration we actually manage inside the product of the vCenter itself. Now, every time we provision a vCenter, well, not every time anymore. It used to be with NSXV that every time we provisioned a vCenter, we have an NSX Manager. We're still seeing a lot of customers follow that methodology where they keep the workload domain as a security boundary. So we would still have an NSX Manager provisioned for each workload domain. But you can provision an NSX Manager that can control multiple workload domains. Depends what your security boundary is. For here, we're going to do an NSX Manager for each one. So we'll just do NSX, NSX, NSX. So at this level for NSX Manager, what we would configure in here is the configuration for NSX. So we would configure our routing, our load balancing, we could configure our microsegmentation, And any other networking services that we need to configure in here, like overlay, we would also configure um, inside the NSX Manager. So to provision the NSX Manager, we would use SDDC Manager, but to actually manage the NSX Manager, we would do that by actually logging into it and configuring it itself. So SDDC Manager sits at the top as sort of like the infrastructure management layer. That's what we would like to refer to it as in many cases. And then we would use the configuration at each of the layers of the products that we were configuring. Now, there are some things in these products that you can't do. As an example, in vCenter, you couldn't go in some of the early versions and change things like the cluster names, as an example. And if you're doing that in the moment, you do still need to do that at the SDC Manager layer. So there are some things that you can and can't do. But for the majority of stuff, configuration in the product itself, and then infrastructure management, updates, lifecycle, as an example, we do at the SDC Manager level. We do see some customers try and do updates under the SDC Manager, so they'll update NSX maybe separately, or they'll apply a patch separately, but that should all be done through the SDC Manager. Okay, so this is the login screen for SDDC Manager. We can see that the URL actually points us back to the PSC that's located on the vCenter, and that's why we see vSphere here as well. But this is the SDDC Manager login screen. So we log in with our administrator at vSphere.local account. This will be an account that you specify during configuration and setup. Make sure you get the username and password right, unlike me. Oh. And then it should log you straight in. Now, as we log in, this is like I've said in the intro, a nested environment that's deployed using VLC. If you don't know what VLC is, I'll put some of the links in the description to go and find it and download the actual player. It's an automated way of deploying some of the nested VCF labs on your home servers or on some environment that you might have access to remotely in a public cloud. So the first thing we'll get welcomed by, and this is fairly vanilla, it's only just been deployed, we've not done any additional config. So we'll get welcomed by this dashboard, and the dashboard covers a number of options which we'll walk through. So solutions are a number of things that you can deploy through SDDC Manager that can be in the environment. So some of these, if we look on this version we've got here, which is 4.31, you'll see that there's none available to us currently, but these could be things such as Kubernetes, as an example here. This is one that which we can deploy and learn, and it deploys based on the VMware validated design, which will soon be VCF validated design guidance. There'll be more added to these as more functions comes available. So as an example, AVI networks could be enabled to this for advanced load balancing sometime in the future. We jump back to our dashboard. The next screen we can see, or window, sorry, is our workload domains. Now, it's important to remember that the management domain is classed as a workload domain. It has management workloads in it. And then we have a VI workload domain, which is what we call the workload domains, which are provisioned and used for most normal users. As an example, if you were to build something to put VMs in, this would be a VI workload domain. If you were to provision a workload domain using Kubernetes, as an example, it'd actually be listed as a VI workload domain under here because it doesn't know what's inside of it. We just call it a general purpose workload domain. Okay, so we can view our workload domains by clicking on the management one, and this will take us into the management workload domain configuration. We'll go over this in a bit more detail in a moment. We don't have any VI ones configured, so we've got a 0 there. We can't go into those currently. So these are the hosts underneath. This is the next window. The hosts in the environment are hosts which have been provisioned and are either being used, or hosts that have been provisioned and are allocated, not allocated, sorry, to a use yet. So many customers that we work with would have a pool of servers available inside there. Maybe the pool is small, 2 or 3, and sometimes the pool is large, say 10 or 11, maybe even 20. I've seen some customers. And these would be for possibly on-demand scaling, depending on what the customer's using the environment for, or it could be for recovery if there is failure somewhere in the environment, or it could be to allow more performance. You could provision more performance into the environment with CPU memory and vSAN's performance as well. We only have 4 hosts, and we're all allocated to the management workload domain. So we can see are all flash hosts, 4 here. We're using 4, there's 0 unallocated, and it's telling us that we have 4 below as well in the management workload domain. Now, scheduled updates is where we would schedule an update possibly to happen out of hours or to happen at a time when the environment's quiet. You don't have to sit here and click through all the updates. You can schedule one, that'll show you here. And then this section would show you the updates that have been applied in the last month to the environment. if we had applied any. Okay, so we move to the next section. This is more of a performance area. So this is like an environment overview this side. The middle one is a performance overview. So we can see total number of CPU we have inside the environment. We can see the total amount of memory, and we can see the total amount of storage. And in these sections, we can see how much out of that total amount that we're using. So for CPU, in the whole of the environment, we're only using 10 gigahertz. For memory, in the whole of the environment, we're using 93 gig out of 162. And in total storage, we're using 0.2 terabytes out of 2.3 terabytes. So we've got space there to expand into. We can see memory usage is here with regards to allocated memory. So the memory that we've got allocated to the management workload domain, we can see the usage of that here, what's free and what's allocated, and the same with the disk space underneath and the CPU above. So this is the whole of the environment, and then underneath here you would see the breakdowns of each workload domain based on that entirety and how much is allocated to that workload domain and how much is consumed. So it gives you a good performance overview. And if you want to see more details, you just click into the workload domain you want to go into, and then it gives you a further breakdown of CPU, memory, and storage inside that workload domain. So our last column is just our recent tasks. So this is things that have been performed, such as adding hosts, deleting hosts, turning stuff on, creating a workload domain. All of that stuff would be listed here for those sort of things that we've done. One other thing, or two other things, we see on this screen at the top are create a workload domain and commission host. So if we want to add hosts into this pool here, they would need to be added to the environment. They need to have an ESXi image on, and then we can click commission host, and this will take us to all of the prerequisites that we need to configure. So you need to make sure that the host you're adding to the environment have all of these things configured, and you tick the box, or you can select all. And then when you go proceed, it'll ask you to actually give the name of the host, fully qualified domain names, and you can add them this way. I don't have any hosts to add, so I'm going to click out of that. And then if we go to our add workload domain, this is a similar sort of screen. It'll ask us what type of workload domain we want to add. We select a vSAN one, we can go begin, and then it will give us the option to add the host into the cluster, which we don't have at the moment for the workload domain, sorry. Okay, so down our navigation pane on the side here, we have several options. We've covered the solutions option. We're talking about that inside the actual dashboard. And in our inventory is much like what we've got on this side of the dashboard as well. We've got workload we've hosts. We've clicked on workload domain briefly. We'll go into it a bit more detail here. So if we click on our workload domain option, we can see all of the workload domains that are provisioned. I only have a management one. The usage, we can see the configuration status, and if we were using NFS, Fibre Channel or vVols, we would see those options down here as well. You can also see available updates. It will tell you here if there's any available updates for the workload domain. And to go into more information, you click on this and it will break down into what's available. So once we're in the workload domain, we've got an actions option at the top here. We can add a cluster, we can add virtual private networks, we can add edge clusters, we can rename the domain as well, which is important. A lot of people choose to do that, although it's advised to keep the management workload domain on as a default name. Below we've got just a couple of statuses, so it's management, it's active, and we can see the version that we've deployed here. So this is 4300. We would in a later video be upgrading this to 431, but we'll keep it on 4300 for now. And then in the summary, we can see the NSX manager and the DNS name in the NSX manager and the storage that we're using as well. So if we were using Fibre Channel, we'd see the data store name down here and then something else as well. We click on the services option, we can see the vCenter and the NSX manager, and we can connect to these directly by clicking on these hyperlinks here, and it'll throw up a window for us to log in. See their IP addresses there as well. Upgrades and patches, this is where we would see upgrades available to us. We can also, if we scroll down like this, see the versions of the products that are deployed. And if we expand them out like we can in vCenter, we can see the different versions of the actual services that are deployed inside SDDC Manager, which is quite cool. And then NSX Manager, the same sort of thing. We can deploy our management, click down to our management cluster, and we can see what clusters this NSX Manager is managing by expanding out the options as well. We can see the hosts, and we can see the version that are available on the hosts. If we go to update history, we can see what was updated, nothing there. If we go to hosts, we can see the hosts that make the environment. We can see the name, IP address, what networking pool they're using. We'll cover that soon. Their status, cluster they're in, and their usage as well. And if they're all flash and what storage they're using. And then clusters, we can see in this option here what clusters are provisioned. Now, because we're in a management cluster, there will only be one. In a VI workload domain, it could be multiple clusters based on what your scaling principle is or what your requirements are for capacity. And in Edge, if we were to provision a specific Edge cluster and not have consolidated NSX architecture, then we would see the Edge cluster nominated in here and the nodes, etc. And then security, these are certificates for the environment. So we can generate certificate requests, we can sign certificate requests, and we can actually integrate this with an open SSL source or a Microsoft certificate source. And we can do all of this by clicking these buttons here, rather than having to go off and do like we used to do with actually creating certificates ourselves, getting all of the elements of it right, etc. Hosts we covered briefly at the start. We'll go through this again, in a bit more detail in this option along the side. You can see all hosts in the environment. You can click on these hosts to go to them specifically to see what configuration they have, what they're being used. You've got some actions as well. You can open the client and actually see what's going on. But for this, what we're walking through here, we're just going to go over quickly, but we can see what the host state is with regards to signed or unassigned, what cluster it's in, CPU usage, memory usage, and what type of storage it's got. Our next option along the side is our lifecycle management. Not many people look at this option, but this is really interesting if you want to see what the differences are on some of the previous versions compared to what you're actually using now. So if you've upgraded through a number of releases, say for example, if this was a 4.0 releases, we can see here what's new really quickly. We can then understand what the versions of the product are that form that BOM, and then we can see the version we've upgraded to is 4.3, so we can actually see the differences are here as well. And what we can also do in here is we can see the different levels of workload domains. So many customers, when we're going through a lifecycle event, won't upgrade all of their workload domains at the same time if they have many, because they can take a long time. There can be some change window constraints, and there can be some maybe some product restraints which require a certain version in those workload domains for some reason. Now, bundle management, we're going to do a separate video talking about upgrades and life cycle, so I'm not going to go over this too much, but this is where we would see the bundles we could download or be uploaded. I have no internet access, so these would be uploaded manually, and then we'll cover that in that life cycle video shortly. And image management as well is if you're using like a HPE, Lenovo or a Hitachi custom image, you'd have those listed here, and we'll cover those in a life cycle video as well in a lot more detail. So if we jump down to administration, we've got things like network settings, storage settings, etc. I'll walk through these in as much detail as we can in this video. So for network pools are what we create as pools of IP addresses for hosts being commissioned to be able to use for specific features. So for example, we've got here vMotion, we've got NFS, and we've got vSAN. We'll ignore iSCSI for now, but we've got these three options, which IP addresses are pulled from those pools when we commission new hosts. So we commission a new host in a VI workload domain, and it will ask us what network pool we want to consume vMotion addresses from. It'll ask us what network pool we want to consume vSAN addresses from as well, and then it will pick the addresses from that pool and assign them to the host it's provisioned. We don't have any pools created currently because I haven't provisioned any workload domains. So storage settings is a new option that some people would have seen in 3.10, I think. And this is where we can enable our VMware VASA providers. So if we're using a fiber channel storage array, we can, ones from the providers such as NetApp, IBM, Dell, etc. They'll all have a plugin that we can use, and we can talk to that actual storage controller to be able to automatically provision access to the host for building in a certain workload domain. So if we've got if we're adding hosts to a workload domain, and then that, for example, they don't have access to the storage due to the way that the storage controller restricts access, etc., for the WWNs or the worldwide names, then we'll be able to use this VASA plugin to add that in there. And this will also be used for things like will be populated in a vCenter for things like cloning and stuff, where we do offloading for that sort of thing to the storage rather than doing it through the host. So this is an important thing for fiber channel and NFS storage. This is a section where we would add all of our users that are going to access the environment. We do have some better user control in this version of VCF, whereas previous versions we had all or nothing. We do have some better version control in here to allow users to do more constrained things. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but you can go online to the VMware doc site and find a better breakdown of this. I might do another video on it later on. Repository, this is where we would set up access to the VMware website to be able to download updates automatically for us, the upgrade bundles, rather than doing them offline. Because my lab's isolated, like I said, I'm going to do another video where I do life cycle, and I'm going to talk about this in more detail. I'm going to talk about also how you do it offline, which is what my lab's going to require. Just for this video, with regards to the repository settings, do not use your own account. What we recommend is that you set up a dedicated account for VCF to be able to connect to, mainly because if you use a user's account, that user leaves or something happens, that user changes a password, etc., you could lock this out, or this could lock that user out, and it can just be very complicated. Composable architecture. Now this I've only ever seen used in one or two customers, mainly in HP Synergy customers, where we can connect to the composable infrastructure layer, and it will help provision profiles into some of the Synergy nodes that are applicable to VCF. It's quite limited in its functionality, and there will be more coming for it in future releases, but at the moment it's a little bit limited in what it can do, but it's definitely something good to explore. The vRealize suite. Now this is where, if we wanted to deploy VRA or VROPS as part of the VCF environment, we would come to this option here, and we'd go through the steps here to deploy a lifecycle manager, and then SDDC Manager would offload the lifecycle of the VCF, VRA and VROPS components and vRealize lifecycle manager to lifecycle manager to manage itself. So it's still kept in sync with the version of VCF that you're running, and there'll still be upgrades when you upgrade to a new version of VCF if you check the BOM. But this is how you would provision it initially. There are some good advantages, but there are also some disadvantages with having VRA linked to VCF, and we'll go over those maybe in another video as well. Now, security, this is where we would configure the certificate authority that I spoke about, so we could add this to a Microsoft option at the top. We also have the option for OpenSSL. Password management is also a good option. We use password, I saved this before it let me jump on. So our password management option is great to be able to use for rotating passwords. So VCF has to know the passwords for all of these components. And this is one of the things where we talk about something that you should and shouldn't do outside of VCF. So if we're life cycling, say for example ESXi3, if we've gone on locally to that host and changed the password locally on it, VCF's not going to know about that change in password. So when VCF tries to do a lifecycle event, tries to pull performance statistics, tries to do certificate management on the host, it's not going to be able to, and you'll see errors. And this applies also to, if you're provisioning VRA, like in the previous section, VRA components as well. VCF needs to keep the passwords for those. Now you can rotate passwords. You can do a rotate where you specify the username, you specify the password, or you can do a rotate where it generates a password as well. Now, any good security admin will tell you even a randomly generated password has still got an algorithm that it's going to use that can be reverse engineered. So very often using an actual specified password is good. Now, a lot of customers ask for integration into password management systems. It doesn't offer that in this system at the moment through this GUI, but there are options for possibly doing that over API, which we could explore later on. Now, backup is also really important. Backup in VCF is something that's not really covered very well in a lot of our documentation, but it is something that needs to be considered when you're looking at availability and disaster and recoverability. So taking a backup of SDDC Manager is really important, and the backup needs to be in a certain timestamp or a certain step with the vCenters and with the NSX managers. As an example, if we restored SDDC Manager and it was restored 6 hours ahead of what the restore for the NSX manager is, there may be actions or events or something that SDDC Manager is expecting in that NSX manager, maybe even configuration changes that aren't there and could cause a number of challenges. So having them within a short time step of each other is definitely recommended, and there's a lot more guidance available on the VMware website. And again, we may do a more detailed informational video on this. VMware CIP, would always recommend you join this. This is great for giving us information of problems. And if you do this in the vCenter, something called vSAN Insight, then this will give you, will give VMware a lot more data on what's happening in your vSAN environment. The Development Center, now this is a great thing to explore as well if you're looking at
for some documentation on how to do something. There's a lot of information already embedded in the appliance here. So if we go through here, we can look at things like the user roles that we were speaking about. So it gives you instructions and some help on that. Gives you some instructions help on the SSO domains. You create a cluster, the instructions are in here for that as well. So that's a great thing to go through. Our API Explorer is also really good to go through if you're looking at using some sort of integration with some of the components inside inside VCF. So if we look at APIs for SDDC Manager, we can see here we've got a number of APIs which we can explore, and we can actually run a value in here to execute and try and see if we get an output that we expect. So this is really useful for exploring the APIs and looking to do some low-level integration into SDDC Manager. And we've got some code samples. So these are based from the VMware code website online. Some of them are downloadable and some of them are embedded into the appliance, but most of them are downloadable offline, and this will update if your SDDC manager has internet access. So some of these are examples of scripts or executables that you can create. Most are in Python, as you can see, but there are some PowerShell ones available out there where you can pull data back or perform actions, and you can even search for free samples. So this is a great resource which is new to 4 and is in some of the later free versions, and is definitely something that I'd recommend a lot of people explore. Now we've gone through that really quickly. Well, I say really quickly. We've spent nearly 20 minutes talking about it. So we are going to do some follow-up videos on some of the sections, but this was always intended to be a high-level overview. If you found that useful, hit share and like and subscribe on below, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.